I stood at the edge of my golden soybean field, squinting against the harsh Nebraska sun, staring at the fresh, jagged tire tracks that cut a muddy scar right through the center of my livelihood. And I remember thinking that this was the 5th time in a single week. The trail was unmistakable. A heavy, wide-bodied vehicle had plowed through my rows, crushing plants I'd spent months nurturing, leaving behind the smell of burnt rubber and a deep sense of violation. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 52 years old, and after 3 decades of grinding my life away in the claustrophobic cubicles of Chicago's financial district, I'd bought these 120 acres of freedom to finally hear myself think. I'd intentionally picked a plot of land that sat just outside the iron-fisted jurisdiction of the Silver Creek Heights Homeowners Association, thinking I'd escaped the petty politics of suburban life. But I was dead wrong. By the time this nightmare was over, a high-ranking official's luxury SUV would be a heap of shredded rubber and twisted metal in the middle of my field. A decades-long embezzlement scheme would come crashing down, and I'd be the most talked-about man in 3 counties. But before we get to the part where the tow trucks arrived, I need to tell you about the woman who thought my private property was her personal shortcut, Beverly Vance. Beverly was the kind of person who didn't oppose. Just walk into a room. She occupied it, usually while checking her reflection in the glass of her husband's mahogany desk. Her husband, Sterling, was the president of Silver Creek Heights, and Beverly was the treasurer, a power couple who ruled their manicured neighborhood like it was a small European fiefdom. They lived in a house that looked like a Greek temple made of stucco, and they drove matching white Range Rovers that they treated like tanks. The problem started about 6 months ago when Beverly decided that driving the extra 4 miles around the county road to get to the boutique shops in town was beneath her dignity. She noticed a dirt access path on the western edge of my property that connected to a back gate of their community, and she simply decided it was hers. The first time I caught her, I was out checking an irrigation line, and this white blur came roaring across the field, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. I flagged her down, standing right in the middle of the path, forcing her to hit the brakes. She rolled down the window, and before I could even say hello, she looked at me with this expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance, like I was a piece of gravel stuck in her designer heel. End quote. You're blocking the right of way, end quote. She snapped, not even bothering to take off her oversized sunglasses. I looked at her, then at the end quote. No trespassing, end quote. Sign she'd just driven past, and I said as calmly as I could, end quote. Mon oppos. There's no right of way here. This is private farmland. You're damaging my crops, and I'm going to have to ask you to use the paved road. End quote. She actually laughed. It was this cold, tinkling sound that didn't oppose. Reached her eyes, and she told me that there was a, end quote, historic easement, end quote, from the 1920s that gave the, end quote, estates, end quote, access to the highway. I've lived on this land for 5 years. I've read every inch of the deed, and I knew for a fact that she was lying through her teeth, but she just put the car in gear, swerved around me, and sped off, nearly clipping my shoulder. I didn't oppose. To want to be the, end quote, angry neighbor, end quote, so I did things by the book. I went to my lawyer, a sharp guy named Miller, who knows property law like the back of his hand, and we did a deep dive into the county records. Not only was there no easement, but the, end quote, access path, end quote, she was using was actually a drainage route I'd constructed myself. Miller sent a formal cease and desist letter, certified mail, with the return receipt and everything. A few days later, I was out by the barn when I heard that engine again. I watched as Beverly slowed down, held my letter out the window, and literally let it flutter into the wind before flooring it, the heavy tires churning up the soil I just fertilized. It wasn't oppose, about the shortcut anymore. It was about dominance. She wanted me to know that my ownership didn't oppose. Matter as long as she had a husband on the board and a lawyer on retainer. The conflict shifted from annoying to devastating on a Tuesday morning in late spring. I have a small herd of heritage belted Galloway cattle, and one of my heifers, Bella, was very close to calving. She was a gentle soul, a bit skittish, and she was grazing near the western fence line when Beverly came barreling through, late for her morning tennis match, I assume. She didn't oppose. Just drive. She blared her horn the entire way, probably to clear the vermin from her path. The sudden noise and the roar of the engine sent Bella into a blind panic. She tried to jump a drainage ditch, stumbled, and fell hard. I found her an hour later, shivering and in distress. The vet came out, but it was too late for the calf. I lost a prize animal and a future for my herd because a woman couldn't and oppose. TB bothered to drive 5 extra minutes. When I called the sheriff, a deputy named Vance, no relation to Beverly, thankfully, came out and took a report, but he sighed and told me straight up, Elias, without video of the car actually hitting the cow, it's a civil matter. I can give her a trespassing ticket, but she'll just pay the fine and keep doing it. People like the Vances, they own this town, That was the moment the neighborly Elias, died, and the logistics manager Elias, took over. I realized that the legal system was a slow-moving beast that Beverly knew how to feed with paperwork, so I decided to change the terrain. I spent 3 days researching the legality of vehicle deterrence. I didn't oppose. T want to hurt her. I'm not a monster, but I wanted her vehicle to be physically incapable of violating my land. Miller told me that as long as I provided excessive and undeniable warning, the liability would shift to the trespasser. So, I went to work. I ordered professional-grade, retractable steel spike strips, the kind the highway patrol uses for checkpoints. I didn't oppose. T hide them in a hole like a trap. I laid them out right on the path, but only after I turned my property into a neon-colored warning zone. I bought 25 industrial-grade signs. Private property. Authorized vehicles only. Danger. Vehicle deterrent devices in use. Tire damage is imminent. I posted them every 30 feet. I even hung a massive banner across the entrance of the path that said, final warning. Stop or lose your tires, I took photos of every sign, GPS tagged the locations, and sent a final certified letter to Beverly and the Silver Creek HOA board with copies of the photos, stating exactly what I had done and why. I even stopped by the sheriff in Oppo's office and showed them the setup. Deputy Vance looked at the photos and whistled. Well, you certainly can and Oppo's. T say she wasn't and Oppo's. T warned, He said, though I could see the concern in his eyes. Just make sure those cameras are rolling, Elias. You're playing with fire, The following Monday, I sat in my farm office, coffee in hand, watching the high-definition feeds from 4 different angles. I felt a knot in my stomach, half anxiety, half grim anticipation. At 8:15 a.m., the white Range Rover appeared at the tree line. She didn't oppose. T even tapped the brakes at the first sign. She didn't oppose. T slowed down at the banner. She drove past 10 different warnings like they were decorations for a party she wasn't oppose. T invited to. I watched her face on the zoom-in lens. She looked bored, checking her makeup in the rearview mirror while steering with one hand. She hit the first set of strips at 40 miles per hour. The sound was like 4 gunshots echoing across the quiet valley. Pop, 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 pop. The Range Rover lurched, the front end dipping as the air vanished from the high-performance tires. In a normal world, a person would stop there. But Beverly? She must have thought I'd thrown rocks at her. She let out a scream I could hear through the cabin mic and actually floored the accelerator, trying to, power through, whatever was happening. She hit the second set of strips 50 yards later, and that was the end of the line. The metal spikes didn't oppose. T just punctured the rubber. They shredded it, and at that speed, the heavy rims began to grind directly into the dirt and rocks, sending up sparks and a spray of mud. The vehicle finally ground to a halt, tilted at a sickening angle, right in the middle of my soy field. I waited 5 minutes before walking out. I wanted to make sure she'd called her husband, her lawyer, and whoever else she needed to witness her humiliation. When I got there, Beverly was standing in the mud, her silk jumpsuit splattered with filth, staring at 4 flat tires that were literally falling off the rims. She looked at me, and her face turned a shade of purple I didn't oppose. T know was humanly possible. You're going to jail. And, quote, she shrieked, waving her phone in my face. End quote. This is assault. This is domestic terrorism. My husband is going to have this farm seized and turned into a parking lot. End quote. I didn't oppose. T say a word. I just pointed to the sign 3 feet away from her that said, in bright red letters, end quote, vehicle deterrent in use, end quote. The sheriff arrived, followed shortly by Sterling Vance in his own SUV, looking like he was ready to declare war. He started barking orders at the deputies, demanding they handcuff me on the spot. But then Deputy Vance did something beautiful. He pulled out his tablet and showed Sterling the footage from my cameras. The footage of Beverly driving past 20 signs, the footage of her accelerating after the first pop, and most importantly, the copy of the certified letter she'd signed for 3 days prior. End quote. Sterling, end quote. The deputy said, and you could hear the fatigue in his voice, end quote. He gave her every chance. This ISN and oppose. A trap. This is a homeowner protecting his land from a documented trespasser after exhausting all legal avenues. If I arrest him, the county is going to get sued into the Stone Age, and frankly, so are you, end quote. But that wasn't an oppose, to even the best part. You see, while the tow truck was struggling to pull the dead Range Rover out of the muck, the Silver Creek Heights HOA was having an internal meltdown. One of the other board members, a retired accountant named Arthur who'd always been a bit suspicious of the Van Cess, had seen the, end quote, incident, end quote, on the local community Facebook group where I'd posted the blurred footage as a, end quote, public service announcement, end quote. Arthur started wondering why Sterling was so adamant about using HOA legal funds to threaten a farmer who was an oppose, even in their jurisdiction. He called for an emergency audit that afternoon. It turns out, when you're the president and treasurer of a wealthy HOA for 10 years and no one dares to question you, you get sloppy. They found that Beverly had been, end quote, redirecting, end quote, community landscaping funds into a private account for years to pay for their car leases, their club memberships, and even the very designer clothes she was wearing when she got stuck in my mud. The, end quote, historic easement, end quote, she'd been shouting about? She'd paid a local clerk a few $100 to forge a digital entry in the county archives, which we discovered when the state investigators did a forensic sweep. The fallout was spectacular. Sterling was forced to resign in disgrace within 48 hours. Beverly was hit with multiple counts of felony embezzlement and grand theft. Because she'd used the HOA and oppose money to pay the lawyer who sent me those threatening letters, it added a layer of mail fraud to the mix. My lawyer, Miller, filed a civil suit for the loss of the calf, the crop damage, and the emotional distress of the harassment. We didn't oppose to even have to go to trial. The Van Cess and oppose. New legal teams settled for 6 figures just to keep the embezzlement details from being read aloud in open court every day. Today, my farm is quiet again. I used the settlement money to build a massive, beautiful stone wall along the western border, and I donated a chunk of it to a local cattle rescue in Bella's name. The Van Cess had to sell their Greek temple at a massive loss to pay back the HOA and their legal fees, and last I heard, they're living in a 2-bedroom rental in a different state, waiting for their court dates. Sometimes, I still sit on my porch with a coffee and look out at that path. The spike strips are still there, tucked away, but I haven't an oppose. T had to use them since. It turns out, word travels fast in rural Nebraska. People learned that just because I moved here for the peace, it doesn't an oppose. T mean I've forgotten how to fight. But it makes me wonder, was I too harsh? Some of my neighbors think I went overboard, that I should have just kept calling the police until something happened. Others say I'm a hero for finally taking down the, end quote, HOA royalty, end quote. What do you think? Did I have the right to protect my land like that? Or did the spike strips cross a line into, end quote, frontier justice, end quote? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought they were above the law? Let's talk about it. And hey, if you enjoyed this story of Karen finally hitting a wall or a spike strip, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps the channel, and I've got plenty more stories of entitled people getting exactly what they asked for. Thanks for stopping by the farm, and I'll see you in the next one.